The town had an odd stillness to it, the kind that lingered long after the sun had set behind the thick forest of trees. Erin and Mark had never heard of West Hollow before finding the listing. It was small, tucked away in the hills, with narrow streets and weathered homes that seemed forgotten by time. The Victorian house, their new home, loomed at the end of a dead-end road, far removed from the modest cottages that lined the rest of the street. It had been abandoned for years, but it was a deal they couldn't pass up. Erin had spent hours online scrolling through endless photos of perfect suburban homes, but nothing felt right until this house came up. A once grand estate with tall gables and large arched windows. There was something hauntingly beautiful about it, despite the chipped paint and overgrown yard. It was a fixer-upper, as the realtor had called it, with loads of potential. From the moment Erin stepped through the front door, though she felt the weight of the house settle on her shoulders, the air inside was thick and musty, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. The wooden floors groaned under her feet, each creak echoing through the high ceilings. Mark, ever the optimist, was already talking about knocking down walls and refinishing the old fireplace. But Erin could only stare at the shadows that clung to the corners of every room, dark and unyielding. The neighbors weren't much better. The few people they passed on the street offered polite but distant greetings, their eyes flicking toward the house before quickly turning away. It was as if the house itself carried a reputation, a history no one wanted to acknowledge. Erin asked the realtor if anything had happened there, but he waved it off. "Just small-town gossip," he said with a tight smile. "Old houses always come with stories." That first night, the house was quiet, almost too quiet. Erin lay in bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds, the wind howling outside, the branches tapping against the window. But there was something else, too. A faint, rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from within the house. At first, she thought it might be Mark, but when she turned over, he was sound asleep beside her, his breaths steady and deep. The next morning, Erin shrugged it off as her imagination running wild. The move had been stressful, after all, and the house was old. Old houses made noise, she reminded herself. She spent the day unpacking, trying to make the place feel like home. But no matter how many boxes she emptied, the house remained cold and unwelcoming. The windows, though large, let in little light, and every room seemed shrouded in a perpetual dusk. By the time evening fell, the unease had crept back into Erin's bones. She tried to push it aside, focusing instead on the mundane tasks of organizing the kitchen. But then, just as she was stacking the last of the plates in the cupboard, she heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. It was soft at first, so faint she thought she might be imagining it. She paused, her hands frozen mid-motion, and listened. The tapping came again, more insistent this time. Her heart quickened and she glanced toward the window. The sun had set, leaving only the inky blackness of night pressing against the glass. Erin's hand trembled as she reached for the curtain, her breath catching in her throat. She pulled it back slowly, half expecting to see something, someone standing outside. But there was nothing. Just the empty yard, overgrown with weeds, and the dark forest beyond. She let out a shaky breath and turned away, trying to convince herself it was just the house settling or a branch brushing against the window. But as she moved toward the sink, the tapping started again. This time, louder. Tap, tap, tap. Erin's stomach twisted. She called out for Mark, but her voice came out quieter than she intended, the sound swallowed by the heavy silence of the house. She forced herself to move, to step away from the window and into the hallway where the light was brighter, less oppressive. Mark was upstairs working on something in one of the bedrooms, blissfully unaware of the strange sounds that seemed to follow Erin wherever she went. That night, as they lay in bed, Erin told him about the tapping. "It's nothing," Mark said, his voice groggy with sleep. "Old houses make noise. It's probably the wind or the pipes." He pulled the blanket over his shoulder and drifted back to sleep, but Erin couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, as though something unseen lingered just beyond the edge of her vision, waiting for her to turn away. Over the next few days, the sense of being watched only grew stronger. Every time Erin walked into the kitchen, she felt it, eyes on her, unseen but undeniable. She began to avoid the room altogether, opting to spend more time in the living room, where the light from the fireplace flickered warmly, chasing away the shadows. But even there, the feeling followed her, a constant, creeping presence that settled deep in her chest. And then came the footsteps. It started as a faint, almost imperceptible sound late at night, just a soft shuffle of movement in the hallway. Erin would lie awake, straining to hear, but the sound always seemed to disappear the moment she got out of bed. Mark never heard it, of course. He would roll over and mumble something about her nerves, reassuring her that the house was safe. But Erin knew better. There was something wrong with the house, something hiding in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. She wasn't imagining things. The house was watching her, and whatever was inside, it was getting closer. The footsteps began the way everything else in the house had, subtle, almost dismissible, as if the house was toying with her, testing her limits. It started one night after Erin had just drifted into that space between sleep and wakefulness, the kind of half-dream where you're not sure if you're awake or not. At first, she thought it was just Mark moving around the house, but then, as she became more aware, she realized that the slow, deliberate sound of footsteps didn't belong to him. They came from the hallway, soft at first, like someone walking barefoot, trying not to wake anyone. She lay there, frozen, her breath shallow as her mind raced through every possibility. An intruder? A loose floorboard? Maybe it was just her imagination again, weaving nightmares out of nothing. But no matter how she tried to rationalize it, the sound persisted. Step, step, step. It stopped just outside their bedroom door, and for what felt like an eternity, there was only silence. Erin's heart hammered in her chest, her body rigid beneath the blankets. She wanted to wake Mark, to tell him to get up and check, but fear had her rooted to the spot. Every second dragged on, the silence growing heavier, more suffocating. Just as she gathered the courage to move, the door creaked softly, as if someone had pressed their weight against it. Her breath hitched in her throat, but the door didn't open. After a few agonizing minutes, the footsteps retreated, moving away, fading into the dark corners of the house. Erin waited, her heart racing, until she could no longer hear them. Only then did she reach out and gently shake Mark awake. "What?" he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Mark, did you hear that?" Her voice trembled, barely a whisper. "Hear what?" He blinked, groggy, rubbing his eyes. "The footsteps. Someone was walking in the hallway. I swear I heard it." He sighed and sat up slightly, glancing around the room. "Erin, you've got to stop this. It's the middle of the night. Houses make noise, especially old ones like this. There's nothing out there." He leaned over and kissed her forehead. "Go back to sleep." But sleep never came for Erin that night. She lay awake for hours, her eyes locked on the door, waiting for the sound to return. The next day, she tried to brush off the experience as another sleepless night playing tricks on her. Maybe Mark was right. Old houses did make noise. She distracted herself with unpacking, setting up the rest of the rooms, and trying to keep her thoughts away from the strange happenings in the house. But that creeping sense of unease never left her. That evening, as Mark busied himself fixing a leaky faucet, Erin decided to call her best friend, Lucy. She hadn't told Lucy much about the house yet, not wanting to sound paranoid, but now it felt like she needed to say it aloud to someone who might understand. "Hey, how's the new place?" Lucy's cheerful voice rang through the phone. "It's big. A little overwhelming," Erin said, trying to sound casual. "But there's something weird about it." "Weird how?" Lucy's tone shifted, suddenly more serious. "I don't know," Erin began, pacing the living room. "I keep hearing things, footsteps mostly, at night, and I get this feeling like someone's watching me." Lucy paused before speaking, her voice lowering. "Have you looked into the house's history? Sometimes places have baggage." Erin's stomach tightened. She had avoided looking too deeply into the rumors about the house, a few vague whispers about the previous owners disappearing. She figured it was nothing more than town gossip. Every small town had its share of ghost stories after all. But now, with Lucy's words echoing in her head, she couldn't ignore it anymore. "I don't want to freak you out," Lucy continued, "but maybe you should. It might explain what's going on. And Erin, don't ignore it. These things can get worse." That night, Erin did what she should have done weeks ago. She went online and searched for any information about the house, its history, its owners, any clue as to why it had been left empty for so long. What she found made her blood run cold. The house had belonged to a couple named the Carsons. They had moved in about 10 years ago, much like she and Mark, eager for a fresh start. But one day they simply vanished. No note, no sign of struggle, just gone. The police had investigated, but the case quickly went cold, and the house had remained empty ever since. Erin stared at the screen, the missing couple's faces frozen in time, their smiles wide and happy. The same faces that had once lived in this house, the same ones that had walked these halls. A chill ran down her spine. The footsteps returned the next night. This time they were louder, more distinct. It was no longer a question of whether she was imagining them. Erin sat up in bed, her pulse racing, listening to the slow, deliberate steps move through the hallway. It was as if someone was pacing, walking back and forth, right outside their bedroom door. She didn't bother waking Mark this time. He wouldn't believe her, not until he heard it for himself. But she wasn't sure she wanted him to hear it. Not anymore. The footsteps stopped again just outside the door. Erin held her breath, her eyes wide as she stared at the thin sliver of light under the door. The air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing down on her. Then, as if to confirm her worst fears, the doorknob slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to turn. She shot out of bed, her body reacting before her mind could catch up. She grabbed Mark's arm and shook him violently, her voice coming out in panicked gasps. "Mark, wake up!" He jerked awake, groggy and confused, but the sound of the doorknob turning snapped him to full attention. He bolted upright, eyes locked on the door as it creaked open an inch. Neither of them moved, frozen in place, waiting for whatever was on the other side to step inside. but nothing came. They sat in silence, hearts pounding in their ears, watching as the door slowly drifted back into place, leaving them alone in the darkness once more. The next morning, Erin called Lucy and asked her to come over. She needed someone else to witness what was happening, someone who wouldn't dismiss it so easily. Lucy agreed, though Erin could hear the hesitation in her voice. That night, Lucy arrived with an overnight bag and a nervous smile. They stayed up late, talking in whispers, as if speaking too loudly might wake something in the house. Erin told her everything: the footsteps, the door, the missing couple. Lucy listened intently, her brow furrowed, but didn't say much. She didn't need to. The fear in Erin's voice said it all. And then, just past midnight, it happened again. The footsteps. Lucy's face went pale, her eyes wide as the sound moved down the hallway, slow and deliberate, just like before. Erin's heart raced as she saw the same fear she'd been feeling reflected in her friend's eyes. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. Neither of them moved. The silence stretched on, thick and oppressive, until the doorknob once again began to turn. This time, they both saw it. Erin sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at her untouched coffee. The steam curled up lazily, but she couldn't feel the warmth anymore. The house had grown colder, physically, yes, but also in a way that chilled her to the core. Something had shifted since Lucy's visit. The footsteps had been undeniable proof. Someone else, something else, was in the house. And yet, Mark remained frustratingly unconvinced. He hadn't been there the next morning when Lucy had woken, pale and trembling, refusing to stay another night. "There's something seriously wrong with this place, Erin," she had said in a shaky voice, her bags already packed. Erin had begged her to stay, if only for one more night, but Lucy had refused. "Get out of here, Erin, before it's too late." Those words echoed in Erin's mind now, hours after Lucy had left. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, and the familiar dread of nightfall began to creep in. Every shadow in the house seemed to stretch longer, darker, and more threatening than before. Mark still tried to brush it all off. "It's just the wind, or the house settling," he had said that morning, frustration lacing his words, but she could see the doubt beginning to crack through his calm facade. Erin wasn't sure how much longer he could pretend nothing was happening, especially after last night. She caught him staring at the door as he left for work, his face tight with something he wasn't ready to admit: fear. Alone in the house, Erin felt more vulnerable than ever. The weight of the unseen presence pressed down on her, thickening the air until it was hard to breathe. She could sense it, lurking just beyond the walls, watching her, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. It wasn't just the footsteps anymore. It was something darker, more sinister, and it was growing bolder. That night, the tension in the house reached a breaking point. Erin lay in bed, wide awake, as the familiar sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. But this time, something was different. The steps were heavier, more deliberate, and instead of stopping outside the door, they continued, pacing, circling. It was as if whatever was out there was growing impatient, agitated by her presence. She squeezed her eyes shut, pulling the blankets tighter around her. Mark was next to her, still blissfully asleep, unaware of the mounting terror just outside their bedroom. Erin wanted to wake him, to force him to hear the footsteps, to make him understand that this was real. But something held her back, a voice in her head whispering that it was better if he didn't know, better if he stayed in the dark. Because what if it was already too late? The pacing continued, moving closer and closer to the bedroom door until it stopped abruptly. Erin held her breath, waiting. The silence was suffocating, the kind of silence that made your skin crawl, like the air itself had gone still in anticipation of something terrible. And then, just as she thought she couldn't bear it any longer, a new sound filled the room. It was a whisper, soft and barely audible, like a breath against her ear. "He's mine now." Erin's blood turned to ice. Her eyes flew open and she shot up in bed, her heart pounding so loud she could hear it in her ears. She turned to Mark, shaking him awake, her voice trembling. "Mark, wake up." He stirred, groggy, blinking in the darkness. "What is it?" he mumbled, sitting up and rubbing his eyes. "Did you hear that?" Erin's voice was tight on the edge of panic. Someone whispered, It said you're theirs." Mark frowned, clearly still half asleep. "What are you talking about?" He glanced around the room, his confusion deepening. "There's no one here, Erin." But Erin couldn't shake the feeling that the room was different, heavier, darker. She could sense the presence lingering, just out of reach. She knew that something had spoken to her, something that was trying to claim Mark. She grabbed his hand, squeezing it tightly. "Please, Mark, I'm not making this up. There's something in this house. It's watching us. It wants you." Mark hesitated, his brow furrowing as he looked into her eyes. For the first time since they'd moved in, she saw a flicker of fear in his expression. But then, just as quickly, he shook his head and pulled her into his arms. "You're stressed," he said softly, stroking her hair. "This house is getting to you. We've been here for weeks and nothing's happened to me. It's just in your head." Erin wanted to believe him, to bury herself in the comfort of his words. But deep down, she knew he was wrong. This wasn't just in her head. The house had its claws in them now, and it wasn't going to let go. The following day, Erin couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the house was closing in on her. She tried to go about her routine, but every room felt off, like it was watching her more closely than before. There was a darkness in the corners, a creeping chill that seeped into her bones. The feeling of being followed had become unbearable, even during the day. No matter where she went, she felt its eyes on her back. She spent most of the day pacing through the house, jumping at every little sound. She couldn't concentrate on anything, not even the most mundane tasks like washing dishes or unpacking the last of their boxes. Everything felt tainted by the presence that hovered just out of sight. That evening, while Mark was still at work, Erin stood in the kitchen, staring out into the backyard. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their branches tapping against the windows like skeletal fingers. But as she watched, she saw something else. A figure, tall, shadowy, standing at the edge of the yard just beyond the tree line. Her breath caught in her throat. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, watching. Erin's hands shook as she grabbed her phone, her fingers fumbling to dial Mark's number. She glanced back at the figure, and for a moment, it was gone. Her heart leaped into her throat. Had she imagined it? But no. There it was again, standing closer now, just beyond the fence, its form blurred and unnatural. Mark's voice broke through the static of her panic. "Erin, what's wrong?" "Mark," she whispered, her eyes glued to the window. "There's someone in the yard." "What? Are you sure? Call the police." I don't know." She blinked and the figure was gone again, swallowed by the darkness. "I don't know if it's real." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Mark's voice was softer now, more serious. "I'll be home soon, okay? Just stay inside." Erin hung up, her heart still racing. She moved away from the window, her back pressed against the wall as she slid down to the floor. The figure was gone now, but she could still feel its presence, lurking somewhere just out of sight. It was no longer just the house. It was something else, something far more dangerous than footsteps or whispers, and it was getting closer. Mark came home an hour later, tense and uneasy. He searched the yard, walking through the tall grass with a flashlight, but there was no sign of anyone. "There's nothing out here," he said as he came back inside, locking the door behind him. "Are you sure you saw someone?" Erin nodded, her voice shaky. "It was there, Mark. I swear it was watching me." Mark hesitated for a moment, then wrapped her in his arms. "We'll figure this out," he whispered into her hair. "We'll get help." But Erin wasn't sure if there was anyone who could help them now. Something had already found its way inside. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows as Erin sat motionless in the dim light of the living room. Shadows danced along the walls, twisting into shapes that seemed almost alive, as if the house itself was breathing. Mark had fallen asleep on the couch beside her, his face pale, dark circles under his eyes from weeks of restless nights. He had stopped arguing with her, stopped trying to convince her that nothing was wrong. Deep down, Erin knew he had felt it too, the presence that clung to them like a second skin. But tonight, something was different. The house was quieter than usual, too quiet. The oppressive silence felt like a weight pressing down on Erin's chest, making it hard to breathe. She hadn't heard the footsteps in days, and the tapping on the windows had ceased. It should have been a relief, but instead, the silence only made her more anxious. She had the suffocating feeling that the house was holding its breath, waiting for something, waiting for them. Erin's eyes flickered to the staircase that led to the second floor. The shadows were darker there, pooling at the bottom of the steps, swirling like black smoke. The same shadows had been following her for days, lurking just beyond her vision, creeping closer and closer. She had tried to ignore them, to pretend they were nothing more than tricks of the light. But now she knew better. They weren't just shadows, they were something else. Something alive. A cold shiver ran down her spine as she stood, her legs shaky beneath her. She didn't want to wake Mark, not yet. He had finally begun to believe her, but Erin knew that the truth was something she had to face alone. She had to understand what the house wanted, why it had latched onto them, why it had chosen them. The floor creaked beneath her bare feet as she moved toward the staircase. The shadows seemed to ripple, parting just enough to let her pass before closing in behind her, like a dark curtain. Her heart pounded in her chest, every instinct screaming at her to turn back, to run. But her feet carried her up the stairs, one step at a time. At the top of the stairs, the air grew colder, so cold that her breath fogged in front of her. The hallway stretched out before her, lined with doors she hadn't opened in weeks. The door, at the very end, always closed, always locked, was slightly ajar. A faint light flickered from within, casting an eerie glow that spilled out into the hallway like a beacon. She had never gone into that room, not since they moved in. The realtor had mentioned it once, briefly, almost as an afterthought. Just an old storage room, he'd said, but Erin had always felt something lurking behind that door, a presence she couldn't explain. Now, as she approached the room, her body was trembling, her mind racing with fear. She reached out a hand, her fingers brushing the cold, tarnished brass of the doorknob. The door creaked open wider as if it had been waiting for her all along. Inside, the room was nothing like she had expected. The walls were lined with old photographs, black and white images of families, couples, children, all staring out from another time. Their faces were blurred, distorted, their eyes dark and hollow. In the center of the room stood a single, old-fashioned rocking chair, swaying back and forth as if someone had just risen from it. Erin's breath caught in her throat as she moved closer to the photographs. One by one, she recognized the faces, not from memory, but from the shadows. These were the people she had seen in the house, the figures that had haunted her from the moment they arrived. The same blurred faces she had seen in the reflection of the windows, the figures that had followed her through the halls. Her stomach churned with nausea as she spotted a familiar pair of faces near the bottom of the wall. The Carsons, the couple that had disappeared, never to be seen again. Their hollow eyes stared back at her, unblinking, as if they were still trapped here, waiting for release. But it was the last photograph that stopped her cold. It was her. Erin's own face stared back at her from the photograph, but it wasn't quite right. Her features were blurred, her eyes dark and empty like the others. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, as if she were fading into the very fabric of the house itself. A soft, almost inaudible whisper curled around her, like the distant sound of wind through the trees. "It's time." Erin's pulse quickened, her chest tightening as she stumbled back from the wall, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening crash. The shadows rushed in, swirling around her, wrapping themselves around her like icy fingers. "You're part of us now." The whisper was louder this time, more insistent, echoing in her mind like a dark lullaby. She felt the cold press of the shadows against her skin, pulling her down, pulling her in. The house had chosen her. It had been watching her from the moment they moved in, drawing her deeper into its grip, feeding on her fear. Erin tried to scream, but the sound died in her throat. The shadows pressed tighter, their weight unbearable. She could feel herself fading, her vision blurring, her body sinking into the darkness. Her heartbeat slowed, each beat growing fainter, softer, until there was nothing left but silence. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the pressure lifted. The shadows withdrew, slinking back into the corners of the room, leaving her standing alone in the center of the eerie stillness. The room was empty now, the photographs gone, the rocking chair motionless. The only sound was the faint creak of the floor beneath her feet. Erin turned slowly, her body trembling with exhaustion, and reached for the door. But when her hand touched the doorknob, she felt it, something cold and slimy, something that wasn't part of the world she knew. She pulled her hand back, her heart racing. The door swung open, revealing the hallway bathed in darkness. The air was thick with a suffocating silence, and in that silence, Erin finally understood. The house wasn't haunted by spirits. It wasn't the souls of the dead that lingered here. It was the house itself. It had been watching, waiting for someone like her, someone who would believe, someone who would open the door, step into the darkness, and never leave. The truth had been in the shadows all along. Erin stepped into the hallway, her heart heavy with the knowledge she could never escape. She was bound to the house now, just like the others. She could feel its presence inside her, gnawing at her mind, whispering secrets she would never understand. She walked back downstairs, her footsteps slow and deliberate, her body moving like a puppet on strings. Mark stirred on the couch, his eyes fluttering open as she approached. "Erin," he asked, his voice thick with sleep, "where were you?" She looked down at him, her lips curling into a small, hollow smile. "Nowhere," she whispered, her voice distant and cold. "I was just looking." Mark nodded, his eyes drifting closed again, unaware of the truth that hung between them. The house had her now, and soon it would have him too.